The 3DS was one tough little cookie. It carried Nintendo through some dark times and had more good games than anybody even had the time to play, all while keeping things at a reasonable price no less. But ever since the Switch arrived on the scene, it was only a matter of time before Nintendo took its final handheld off the case.
You're off the case. Your security clearance is hereby cancelled.
And despite the fact that it hung on a lot longer than anybody thought it would, it was finally announced in 2019 that while Nintendo was going to keep making hardware, they weren't going to make any more first-party games for it ever again. But even though N-Dog's eternally grateful to the 3DS for keeping them on the road while the Wii U was passed out behind the wheel, there's still 10 blunders and shortcomings behind the history of the final handheld that they'd rather people forget about entirely. And as you might have noticed, we're on YouTube right now where many channels make videos of things that corporations would like you to forget, which is always fun.
And I thought, I'll just rip it off. I can do what I want.
So make yourselves comfortable, tell your father to pipe down, write a letter to your congressman demanding that this channel get a tax break, press the subscribe button if you haven't already, and allow me, the oldest boy alive, Cameron, to tell you 10 things that Nintendo wants you to forget about the 3DS. Number 10. The launch. After the Wii launched, it was consistently selling out even more than I did when I endorsed a product or two that I wasn't necessarily proud of. It was hard to get your hands on one of these for a few years, and when the 3DS launched, many people, including myself, were expecting the same thing. But when I showed up to GameStop to pick up my pre-order, I realized there were being buttholes and not even doing a midnight release. So then I dragged my ass over to Walmart in hopes of just picking one up there and canceling my pre-order the next day, just because I'm that impatient. And I was pretty sure it was a long shot, but there was literally not even one person there to get one other than my dumbass. And after I explained what a 3DS was to a confused employee, he managed to find one for me in the back, and I was on my way. Without a game, that is, because the launch lineup was one of the worst ever, in my opinion. I picked up Street Fighter 4 the next day just so I could have some kind of game to play in 3D, even though fighting games really aren't my thing. But other than that watered-down version of a popular fighting game, Nintendo offered 2 first-party titles to choose from, with one of them being what I consider to be a tech demo from the Super Nintendo that I have no idea how it ever got popular in the first place. And the other game was Steel Diver, which I thought looked like trash at the time, and I was proven correct years later when I gave the game an optimistic try. And apparently I wasn't the only person who thought the 3DS had a terrible launch lineup, because the lack of a scene at Walmart wasn't just an isolated non-incident. The fact was that nobody wanted to pay $250 for a Nintendo system that didn't have any games. So to rectify this problem, the price was cut down to $170, which ultimately led to Nintendo's CEO at the time, Satoru Iwata, to take a pay cut. After all, it was kinda his fault for just assuming everyone would buy a 3DS without any games, just because the original DS was so popular. Which just goes to show that getting cocky on top's a mistake that console makers never seem to learn from. But due to the severe price cut, people who bought a 3DS at full price were given an ambassador icon, which came with free NES games as an apology, as well as Game Boy Advance games, which to this day is the only official way to play those on a 3DS. That is, of course, unless you hack it, which leads us to... Number 9. The 3DS was easy to hack. Personally, I don't know how to hack a 3DS, and I never really wanted to learn how to either, because I didn't want to risk bricking it or anything. And unless we're talking about Classic Edition consoles, I try to keep my game systems as authentic as possible. But most people don't think like me, and unfortunately for Nintendo, they didn't do a very good job at preventing people from adding whatever games they wanted, or even downloading games from the eShop for free. And no matter how many firmware updates the above-average sized N dished out, fans quickly figured out how to get around whatever Nintendo put in their way. Number 8. The 3D was pointless. Back when the successor to the original DS was on the drawing board, the above-average sized N thought that a simple graphical upgrade just wasn't enough. And with public interest in 3D being back for what felt like the 50th time, it kinda seemed like a good idea to give the third dimension another college try after the failure of the Virtual Boy. But it wasn't too long after the launch when people remembered that 3D wasn't really that cool. I mean, it still exists in movie theaters, but most people only see 3D movies if they don't feel like waiting for the next 2D showing. And even though the 3D on the 3DS surprisingly didn't damage your eyes, most people only really used it here and there for a few seconds when they remembered it was a thing. And much like with movies, it wasn't long before people stopped caring about 3D altogether, which is why they eventually made a lot of 3DS games that didn't even bother with 3D, as well as why the 2DS eventually came along for people who just wanted to play the games. And if you can make a console considerably cheaper without sacrificing anything people actually want, then why not just do it? Still though, given the fact that 3D was quietly swept under the rug probably means that Nintendo would rather we just forget that it ever existed. And personally, I think that's kind of a shame. It's not worth paying extra money for, but the technology was pretty impressive, especially when they added face tracking to the new 3DS models. But speaking of the technology of the 3DS... Number 7. The patent lawsuits. Even though most people didn't give a monkey's nutsack to actually turn the 3D on, most people were at least impressed with the fact that you didn't have to wear glasses. But one group of people who weren't impressed was Tomita Technologies, who sued Nintendo for stealing their patent without paying royalties.
Allegedly!
The accusation didn't really have anything to do with 3D without glasses, and way more to do with how the illusion was created. The lawsuit dragged on for years, and the victory was actually initially awarded to Tomita, but then Nintendo won in the appeals when it was determined that the two methods weren't the same. Long story short, the court thought that while the 3DS used two images to create a 3D illusion, it wasn't done quite in the same way as Tomita's old patent, which meant that Nintendo didn't have to pay $15 million in damages. But even though Nintendo was ultimately able to prove their innocence, most people only really know that they lost at first, and probably assume that they did in fact steal the technology. Number 6. They forgot the right analog stick. When the 3DS was first revealed, most industry experts, including the assistant manager to my local Circuit City, were baffled at the fact that a gaming platform released in 2011 didn't have two analog sticks. And Nintendo realized they botched it too, so they added a thumb nub to the right side of the consoles in later models. And on top of the price cut, this made early 3DS adopters like myself feel even dumber, especially if they got a Circle Pad Pro just to play one Resident Evil game. Number 5. Fire Emblem letting you convert a character's sexuality. Most people probably don't know about this because Nintendo cut it from the localizations, but in the Japanese version of Fire Emblem Fates, there's a female character named Soleli, I guess, who's heavily implied to be a lesbian by talking about how she can't focus on fighting with all these cute girls around. And since Fire Emblem's kinda known for its polarizing waifu system that lets you marry and bear children with certain characters, you'd think this girl would be left off the market for the male players. But if you own the Japanese version and really want this character to ride the baloney pony, then you do have the option to help this character focus on battles by spiking her drink with a magic potion that causes her to see men as women and vice versa. And if you keep building a bond with this character, they'll eventually fall in love with you, assuming you're a woman. And eventually the potion wears off and the character admits they still love you despite the fact that you're a man. But apparently it just determines on how you interpret the translation. The other side of the fence says that while you can interpret it that way, the true intention of the developers was lost in translation. Apparently she was a bisexual all along with a preference towards men and no marriage option at all if you play as a female. Either way though, Nintendo just cut this scene altogether because they didn't feel like dealing with controversy with one of the more popular franchises. And whether the context was lost in translation or not, they'd rather you just forget the whole thing ever happened. Number 4. It wasn't region-free. One of the best things about Nintendo's handhelds is that they've always been region-free, which was always great because it meant you were able to play games that weren't available in your region or hard to find. If you want to play Mega Man 5 on the Game Boy, but you're sick and tired of selling your body to that guy Ted who works at White Castle, then you could just buy the Japanese version for a lot less money. And even though there's still a lot of games that are unplayable due to a language barrier, pretty much any console that's ever existed has games that don't require reading. But then, for some unknown reason, Nintendo thought it was a good idea to be a dick with the 3DS and region lock it. Not really sure why they never bothered region locking handhelds till the 3DS, but it's still pretty lame they decided to do it, because it's something they consciously had to go out of their way to do, and having region locks put into place just makes consumers feel like they're being locked in a cage. Thankfully though, I'm pretty sure someone gave Nintendo a good ass whooping in private, because the Switch went right back to the region-free utopia that makes the world a better place. Number 3. StreetPass. The third dimension wasn't the only feature added to the 3DS to make it stand out from its predecessor. There was also the often overlooked StreetPass that was never required for games, but it always made them better. Just by carrying your 3DS around with you, you could exchange game data and Miis with other systems you come into close proximity with. And doing this would unlock some pretty cool bonuses for games. Plus, the 3DS had a few games built in for free that you can only play if you made tags with other people. And even if you lived in the middle of nowhere, you could still earn a few coins with your 3DS by walking around with it, even if you don't come into contact with anybody. And if you use these coins in games, it pretty much gave you the same perks as encountering people. At best, you loved StreetPass, or at worst, you were indifferent about it. And I know you're probably thinking, hey, buttwagon, if it was so cool, then why would Nintendo want us to forget about it? Well, because unless you wear cargo pants, then the Switch is probably a little too big to comfortably fit in your pocket. At least not as comfortably as the 3DS did anyway. So losing StreetPass with the Switch really wasn't all that shocking to me, although I was kinda hoping for something similar. But since not including a popular feature could only really be seen as a step back, plus, given the fact that Nintendo never specifically announced that this feature wouldn't be returning, it's probably best that nobody brings it up at Nintendo's next Christmas party. Number 2. The Swapnote incidents. Swapnote was a neat little 3DS app that let players send stylized notes and photos to each other via Wi-Fi. It never lit the world on fire, but it was still pretty fun. But then in late 2013, it was announced out of nowhere that the service was ending. Unfortunately, the reason for this is because of a few incidents in Japan involving middle-aged men having 11 and 12-year-old kids send them photos that their parents probably wouldn't have been too happy about. There was also another incident where two men actually ended up getting a 12-year-old to visit a hotel room through the app, but according to some sources, that incident didn't happen because of Swapnote specifically. Either way, the 3DS was involved in it. And even though the blame should be placed on the parents more than the app itself, Nintendo's never been the type of company to go anywhere near controversy, especially when it comes to stuff like this. And since no one was really passionate about Swapnote, they just discontinued it altogether. And I can't help but blame this exact fiasco for being the reason why Nintendo's online services are still stuck 20 years in the past. I guess they're afraid history will repeat itself. Number 1. It killed the Wii U. This one's probably gonna throw most of you for a loop, but bear with me. I know the Wii U was doomed to fail from the start. It had poor marketing, no games to launch with, the gamepad sucked, you get the picture. But the main reason it failed that no one seems to talk about is the fact that the 3DS was cheaper, portable, had more games, and most importantly of all, the graphics really weren't that much worse, which meant you didn't even need to sacrifice quality if you didn't feel like buying a Wii U. Sure, some of the games were a little better on the Wii U, but not really enough to justify spending twice as much money to not even have the option to take games with you on the go. All hope for games like Mario Kart 8 or Smash 4 salvaging the Wii U were lost, because the 3DS already had versions that were almost as good. And the fact that these games came to the 3DS first really downgraded these Wii U titles from must-own to you should probably pick it up if you happen to have a Wii U already. And since the 3DS had an assload of exclusives on top of pretty much every system seller the Wii U touted, it was just a much better option for most people. And the 3DS's murder of the Wii U helped Nintendo realize that with graphics being fine on just about everything these days, there was really no reason to split games up between a handheld and a console anymore, so they might as well just merge them. And as of 2019, the 3DS has still never been convicted for the Wii U's murder, not due to lack of evidence, but because of a lack of awareness. But two detectives who were smart enough to put that sick bastard behind bars once and for all are today's patrons of the day, Dojin Shinji and Tim Ford. If you want to join these two legends, then consider supporting this channel on Patreon for loot boxes and Polaroids in the mail. And if you pick up one of our shirts or mugs that are guaranteed to land you a hot date, then you can make cameos in our video doing whatever you want by simply sending us pictures or videos of you rocking it like these badasses right here. What are some things about the 3DS that you think Nintendo wants swept under the rug, though? I'm pretty sure there's some things I left out, or things that you probably think I shouldn't have brought up. Either way, let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll try my goddamnedest to respond to everybody. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell to see more videos like this. And if you want to help this channel grow, then simply liking and sharing goes a long way. My name's Cameron, and I'll see you next time.
So I want to say thank you to your loyalty, thank you for your support.